Militant empathy. Hey, it's your gal, Militant Empathy, and this month we're going to be talking about mental health. If you're new here, this is a show where I pick a new topic each episode and unpack it from a variety of different angles for about an hour. So far, I've covered a pretty broad range of things, from the ethics of applied transformative justice politics, to the history of the police, to the origin of borders, to the sexual politics of witch hunts. If you want to check out any of the old episodes, they are all available on all major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. So this month I'm going to cover the topic of mental health. And within that, I'm going to explore some themes which are critical of psychiatry. And I'll also explore a fair bit of medical history. I want to preface that discussion by saying that, I am not a medical professional, nor am I some other kind of mental health professional. So where I am going to make criticisms of psychiatry and other medical professions, let's be clear that this will come from a political and sociological perspective, not a clinical one. So definitely do not take any arguments I make in this episode as clinical advice. I'll also be touching on themes of physical and mental abuse and social oppression, which some listeners may find distressing. I'll flag the heavier themes as we go, but if you're feeling like this is just generally not really your vibe today, feel free to give this episode a miss. Maybe listen back to one of the earlier episodes. I can't promise that they'll be much lighter, but maybe just a more acceptable form of heavy. Right, now that we've got the housekeeping out of the way, I want to start this episode by talking about clinical psychologist, therapist, and viral TikToker. Think about how horrifying that combination of terms is for a second. Arianna Brandolini. So for those of you who, like me, are also terminally online, you may remember Dr. Brandolini from her viral 30-second TikTok of January 2023, where she provided advice on how to break up with a friend by saying such deranged things as, "I've treasured our season of friendship," and "I don't have capacity to invest in our friendship any longer." Perhaps unsurprisingly, the TikTok was overwhelmingly, shall we say, not very well received, and was in fact widely criticized for using what viewers thought to be condescending and awkward language, symptomatic of what one viewer called a corporatification of friendship. Now, I'll put my cards on the table and say that one reason this video really hit a nerve with me is because that very same month, I had received a similar corporate friendship-style breakup text from a person who was, in hindsight, probably one of the worst people I've ever met. And yes, I know that's not very militant empathy of me, but I'm allowed to maintain a political philosophy of empathy and still think that some people are assholes, okay? I am just a girl and have to be allowed to be full of rage, at least some of the time, for my own sanity. So, what exactly is so wrong with this scripted friendship breakup? What exactly is going on with the corporatification of friendship? Why exactly has this rubbed people up the wrong way? What's behind all of this is, I'm going to argue, the mainstreaming of what we'll call therapy speak. Now, therapy speak is something that was talked about a lot in the early 2020s when talk of toxic relationships seemed to be everywhere, and phrases like boundaries and gaslighting were rising in popularity, at least according to Google Trends. So a lot of op-eds, essays, and short-form videos at the time spoke about the rise of so-called therapy speak to describe what was essentially the infiltration of language that had typically been reserved for the therapist's couch into everyday conversation. Alongside this general linguistic shift, there was also a concurrent increased interest in psychiatric conditions, many of which have become the subject of vast swathes of social media content, such as autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD, a number of personality disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, to name but a few. Additionally, we've also seen a rise in interest in psychological theories like attachment theory, originally developed by British psychiatrist John Bowlby in the 1960s to describe how the nature of an infant's early relationship with their mother would shape the patterns of their relationship styles or attachments as adults. In fact, attachment theory has now become so commonplace in everyday conversation that it's a memeable fact that anyone trying to speak to probably mostly women on dating apps, will at some point be asked A, their big 3 zodiac placements, and B, their attachment style. The meme being that any straight man who knows either of these things about himself is, shall we say, for the streets. So we're not just seeing this linguistic shift towards therapy speak, but a more generalized shift toward a therapeutic framing of the self and of society. But what exactly is the nature of that framing, and what is the nature of that speech? In a 2021 essay for The New Yorker, writer Katie Waldman argues that the specific brand or flavor of therapy speak that has come into popular misuse has pretty distinctly Freudian roots. So who the fuck is Freud? Well, I actually kind of can't believe that I haven't spoke about our dear old pal Sigmund Freud really yet at all on this show. But there's a first time for everything, kids, so buckle up. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist who was active in the late 19th and early 20th century. So he's officially considered the father of modern psychoanalysis, which is that, lie back on the couch and tell your therapist about your dreams kind of therapy. And unofficially, by me, considered to be the grandfather of the daddy dom little girl and mummy kinks. Anyway, much of the Freudian method of psychoanalysis is based around the assumption that the human mind is split into the conscious and unconscious or subconscious mind, both of which are thought to contain the many urges and desires that shape our behaviors and ways of thinking. Freudian psychoanalysis, then, is largely about bringing our unconscious desires and urges to light and understanding the experiences or relationships that formed them so that we can change behaviors or ways of thinking that are causing us distress. For example, there was the case of Bertha Pappenheim, known famously under the pseudonym Anna O, in Freud's writing. Anna O was the patient of Freud's teacher, Dr. Joseph Breuer, and a lot of Freud's early thinking about, the utility of talking therapies was based on their course of treatment. So Anna O was a young woman of high intelligence who began experiencing visual disturbances, hallucinations, partial paralysis, and speech problems shortly after the death of her father. Dr. Breuer diagnosed Anna with hysteria, a fan favorite of clinicians treating women in the late 19th century, more on that later, and succeeded in treating her illness exclusively through talking therapy and hypnosis. So this consisted of first putting Anna into a hypnotized state and letting her detail extensively the various daydreams that she suffered from when she was in her frequent states of what Freud would call absence, or what we might today call something more like disassociation. And once she had exhausted these details, asking her more explicitly about the first time she had experienced the various symptoms that she suffered from. And it was in these discussions on the origins of her afflictions, in the uncovering of what we might call the original traumas, that Breuer was ultimately able to cure Anna. Because at least in Anna's case, the act of revealing the original trauma was enough to alleviate and ultimately end the disturbance it was causing her. Now, I'll put my cards on the table again and confess that I've done probably several years of Freudian-inspired talking therapies over the course of my life, because Argentinians are absolutely fucking obsessed with Freud, which is just one of our many national red flags. And I just don't really buy into this whole, uncovering the original trauma heals the trauma thing. I remember one time I turned around to an old therapist of mine who had probably been seeing for about 3 years at that point, and I was like, Steve, when are we going to get to the whole fixing part of the therapeutic process? I know my whole origin story back to front, inside out. I know where XYZ comes from. But if they say that knowing is half the battle, it really seems like it's the much easier half. Probably a good time to mention also that Freud liked to ingest enough cocaine to kill a small horse on a fairly regular basis, and thought that most distress in females could be put down to penis envy. But anyway, all this to say, this is what Freudian psychoanalysis is based on. It's based on a kind of confessional model where it's thought that if you dig really, really deep, you can uncover these sort of secret hurts from your past and understand why your present is the way that it is. But what mainstream therapy speak does is quite different. It's Freudian adjacent, but it's very distinct. So where in Freudian psychoanalysis, the emphasis is on introspection and external stimuli or conditions are explored to understand what is within, mainstream therapy speak is almost completely devoid of any self-reflection. So whilst it has this veneer of deep self-knowledge, I am at capacity, I know my boundaries, these are my needs, etc., 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 There's never really a prompt to assess your own reactions or behavior, where these needs might come from, if they are actually needs, what they reveal about your secret hurts or original traumas. It's revealing, right, that most of the viral therapy speak content has been about protecting your peace in some way, with the inherent assumption that your peace is in fact under threat. I have never once seen a thread or a reel or article that invites you to critically assess your own life or behaviors. So in addition to that 2023 video I mentioned on friendship breakups, there's been loads of Twitter threads with templates for things like how to say no to social plans. So one particularly viral thread from 2019 advises readers who apparently want to cancel on a friend that is expressing some sort of emotional need to say, "Hey, I'm so glad you reached out. I'm actually at capacity / helping someone else who's in crisis / dealing with some personal stuff right now. And I don't think I can hold appropriate space for you. Could we connect (brackets later date or time) instead / do you have someone else you could reach out to?" Now, I'm not saying that it's never appropriate to take a step back or do less for others or protect your own emotional well-being. What I am saying is it's revealing that at no point in this entire cultural discourse is an assessment of our own reactions, our own behavior, or our own actions required, nor is any assessment of whether these are justified or ethical. For mainstream therapy speak, then, the question is not why do I feel this way? It's more a statement. It's a statement of, I feel this way, therefore, or even an accusation of, what are you doing to make me feel this way? And I think this is one of the reasons why therapy speak has become so popular, because it has this discursive utility. It has this function, this outcome of pulling the focus away from the speaker. It serves to shut down any critical analysis of whether the speaker's own role, behavior, or agency in the situation is contributing to some kind of negative outcome. And this is something that we can see in an example that we talked a lot about in the episode on justice, which was the now infamous text exchange between Jonah Hill and his now ex-girlfriend, a professional surfer and model called Sarah Brady, on Hill's so-called boundaries. So these included several definitely reasonable and proportionate boundaries that were all conveniently centered on things Sarah should not do, like surfing with men, reminder that Brady is a professional surfer, boundaryless, inappropriate friendships with men, neither what constituted boundaryless or inappropriate was defined, by the way, modeling, bearing in mind Brady was also a professional model, and posting pictures of yourself in a bathing suit, again, reminder that she was a professional surfer, and my personal favorite, friendships with women in unstable places from your wild and recent past. So Hill is very clearly, with this list, trying to weaponize the language of boundaries to exert control over his now, thankfully, ex-girlfriend. Now, a lot of internet discourse, both about this incident specifically and more generally around the misuse of terms like boundaries, has made jokes like, "Oh, we should have never let the men into therapy. Now they've turned it against us," which I do admittedly find incredibly funny as a joke. But if I was to take a more serious position on it, what I would say is it's not that the men have weaponized therapy speak. It's that this language is inherently open to misuse. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And the first is that therapy is not an ethical language, right? You don't go to therapy to become a better person. You go to therapy in order to suffer less. And for some people, that process of trying to lessen the crushing weight of existence makes them a better person. But for a lot of people, it doesn't. And it's not a prerequisite of success in a therapeutic context. So one of the tweets that I've posted on the Insta carousel for this episode is one that says, "The worst person you know is in therapy right now, being told they can be a little bit selfish sometimes." And that's fucking true, right? Going to therapy does not necessarily make you a better or even just basically good person. And girls, getting your man to go to therapy will not necessarily make him a good partner. Just putting that out there as someone who has learned that lesson the extremely hard way, shall we say. The second reason that therapy speak is rife for misuse is more academic and less about the boundless spite and bitterness that fills my cold dead heart. And that reason is that therapeutic language, whether Freudian or not, is a medicalized discourse because it originates from medical fields like clinical psychology, psychiatry, etc. And as such, borrows from the authority of medicine itself. Now, a philosopher that we've spoken about quite a lot on this show, particularly in the episode on community, is Michel Foucault, and he has written extensively about the power dynamics that surround medical language. So in the 1960s, Foucault coined the term the medical gaze to describe the power dynamic that's occurring when we're using diagnostic language. He argued essentially that the speaker who is making the diagnosis is objectifying the patient, and he meant that in the very literal sense, that the person making the diagnosis comes to view the person that they are diagnosing not as a human being, but as a physical object upon which the various symptoms of the disease are displayed for those with a trained medical eye, for those who are well versed in medical language. And this part was like key to the oppressive nature of the medical gaze. So it's not just that the gaze itself is objectifying, that it establishes this unequal power dynamic between the patient and the doctor. It's that the doctor is not objective. It's that the doctor is not actually uncovering some like ultimate truth of disease that the body is revealing through physical symptoms. Rather, they are, for Foucault, more a kind of expert user of medical language, and they can read this onto the objectified body to decide how to interpret, understand, and ultimately treat it. The entire medical gaze, then, is filtered through and indeed created by medical language. So for Foucault, the main thing here is that medical language is a language of power because it carries with it an assumption of objectivity and rationality. This inherently places the user above the receiver because we assume that medicine itself is objective and rational. But is that assumption justified? So once upon a time when I was less jaded by the crushing need to be able to pay for things, nice time to mention the Patreon here, actually. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe at patreon.com/militantempathy. But yes, in my younger years, I was actually studying to become a professional historian, and I had a particular interest in medical history. So this section of the show should hopefully be very much within my wheelhouse because we're going to talk about the history of psychiatry. Now, psychiatry as like a formal medical specialty is actually quite new. It emerges really in the mid-19th century, so the 1800s, with what historians in the past have called the first psychiatric revolution. And no, that didn't mean that there were a bunch of therapists out in the street rioting, pitchforks in hand, demanding greater self-awareness from the masses, funny as that would be. The revolution referred more to a shift in methods and approaches used to treat the insane. Because in as much as psychiatry is new and emerging in the mid-19th century, regimes for treating the insane were well established long before this. And in this section, we're going to discuss some of these regimes. So expect to hear about medical so-called treatments and theories that some listeners may find distressing because of their frankly horrifying nature. Now, to return to my main man, Foucault, he has written pretty extensively about this history in two of his books, Madness and Civilization and The Birth of the Clinic. And in both books, he does this very typically Foucault-type argument, where he takes the general assumption that society has gradually gotten better, more humane, and more progressive over the course of history, that's inherent to a lot of Western thought, and he picks it apart, essentially arguing, well, look, we might think that X thing here being modern psychiatry, is better than what came before, just letting mad people roam around free and largely untreated. But actually, here's why X thing is in fact much more repressive and inhumane. And this is essentially the same basic structure of argument that he makes in all his books, or at least the ones that I've read. So he does this with like the modern prison system and Discipline and Punish, arguing that it actually created a carceral state that was far more repressive because it's based on near total surveillance than the old regimes of just like chopping people's hands off in the village square for crime. He's also done it with sexual norms and history of sexuality, where he argued that modern sexual politics may appear more liberated than historical ones, but they actually aren't because of XYZ. Basically, Foucault's take is always to disrupt the notion of linear progress through historical time and argue that everything that seems less like a prison nowadays is actually much more like a prison than historical prisons, which is why we have the like Foucault butterfly prison meme, which you can also see in the Instagram carousel that I've posted to accompany this episode. Now, I and a lot of other historians don't wholeheartedly buy into Foucault's take because he seems to have a tendency to romanticize the past, and because things like getting your hands chopped off or being left to wander the earth for the rest of your life in an untreated schizophrenic rage actually seem pretty objectively bad, even if the systems that we have today are also quite bad. But the reason why he remains so influential in the history of medicine is because he's like the first main guy to really question these myths that medicine had been telling about itself, basically since the Enlightenment era, which was essentially a lot of white men patting themselves on the back for their ever-improving rationality and civility, and for moving away from the more barbarous medical procedures of the Middle Ages. And that was definitely very necessary, because otherwise we would just be uncritically buying into the propaganda that the psychiatric profession had been telling about itself since inception. So what exactly was happening in this period? Well, the main change was theoretical. Essentially, people come to increasingly believe that you can authoritatively identify, diagnose, and treat various kinds of insanity, that insanity can be cured. And this belief spurns a flurry of theories on how best to do that. Now, it's not that, people before this time never thought that insanity could be cured. It's more that they thought that the cure, if there was one, would be a kind of act of God, rather than a systematic medical treatment process. This is why earlier approaches of dealing with the insane largely relied on either sedating them, tying them up and leaving them somewhere, or casting them out of society, often depending on how wealthy and powerful the specific insane person was. In the 19th century, however, we begin to see the ascendance and authority of the psychiatrist, a new kind of physician that promised to unlock the mysteries of the mind and cure its ailments. And Foucault argues that this was basically a very bad thing, because it created a new and more oppressive power structure of the insane, including a new system of what he essentially, surprise, surprise, characterizes to be prisons, this time in the form of asylums. Now, propaganda might have seemed like a particularly strong word to use there to describe the psychiatric profession's portrayal of itself, but in a very literal sense, it's true. So as historian Andrew Scull has emphasized, the new system of asylums emergent in the 19th century essentially had to promote and advertise themselves in order to survive. So the asylum system first emerges in the UK in two tiers. At the lower level, there were the state asylums who served the lower classes and were funded by the municipality. And at the upper level, there were the private asylums who served primarily the moneyed classes and were funded by rich individual clientele. Both levels had to compete to ensure their economic viability. They had to, more or less, win the hearts and minds of the population and convince them that the asylum could provide a cure where other routes could not. State asylums were essentially competing with other institutions that had long housed, or perhaps more appropriately put, locked up the poor, such as workhouses and jails, and the richer private asylums had to compete with alternative at-home treatments for the insane. In both cases, this advertising largely relied on portraying the asylum as a more humane and modern route than the alternatives. This included doing things like designing new kinds of buildings that were supposed to embed the therapeutic purpose of the asylum into its very architecture, placing particular emphasis on things like separating different kinds of inmates to ensure proper behavior, whether that be, separating by sex or by age. It also included things like placing emphasis more generally on a cheerful and pleasing aesthetic that was supposed to placate the inmate and also reflect the compassionate values of the asylum. These were supposed to look and feel substantively different from a jail. Finally, a lot of emphasis was placed on the move away from mechanical restraints. So institutions that had preceded the modern asylum, like the madhouse or the jail, frequently evoked powerful images of people lying in chains for years at a time. The modern asylum tried very hard to move away from this image and emphasize its use of so-called moral treatment, which was basically a kind of like free-range lunatic who was not physically restrained but was instead gently coached back to sanity by teams of medical professionals. However, as historian John Walton has highlighted in his case study of the asylum in Lancaster, in practice, asylums did not rely on the so-called moral treatment route for very long, basically because it was much more expensive than just chaining people up. And in the face of challenging financial pressures and overcrowding, the asylum would still resort to this more traditional custodial holding regime. So in sum, why do I say it's propaganda? Well, because beneath this veneer of domestication, asylums were still incredibly violent places. And for all the self-congratulatory myth-making the psychiatric profession undertook at the time, they were still rife with all kinds of abuse, including sexual abuse. Now you might say, well, aren't you being a bit harsh here? If we judged any 19th century institution by today's standards, of course we would think that it's inhuman. Of course, we would think that it's inhumane. But my point is not just that a lot of what we think of when we consider the history of psychiatry is basically their own advertising. It is that psychiatry, like any system of knowledge and power, operates within its own social context and so mimics the injustices of that social context. So this is to say, when we claim that the medical professions are objective and rational, we're kind of implying that they are above the general muck of society, that they are somehow separate from the biases that permeate that muck. It's like that, right-wing male podcaster talking point, facts don't care about your feelings, as if these things exist in binary opposition and there is a neat little group of things that are facts, and then there is a separate neat little group of things that are feelings. When in reality, I think those distinctions are much, much hazier, and how we interpret facts, what we choose to recognize as a fact, what criteria is used to assess a fact, all of that can be very feelings-based, and as a result can be very heavily influenced by the societal biases that they pretend to be above. And I think that the history of psychiatry's treatment of women, particularly poor women, is an instructive example of this. Predictably then, by the mid-19th century, the majority of not only asylum patients, but all psychiatric patients in England were women. And the reason for this is a kind of patriarchal pathologization of female distress. So what do I mean by that? Well, the term pathologization just means to interpret something as a disease or disorder. So you could say to me, like, I feel sad, and I could hear that as your current state of mind. Or if I were in a pathologizing mood, I could hear that as the symptom of some kind of wider mental disorder. What about patriarchal? Well, the term patriarchy gets thrown around a lot, and it's not often explained. So I'm going to give it a shot here. So the word itself comes from the Greek word patriarchos, meaning ruling father, and it is often used to refer to a system of governance that follows this kind of daddy knows best approach. So there is supposed to be this superficially benevolent but ultimately quite tyrannical male authority figure in whose gaze women are largely infantilized, if not directly excluded. It's a kind of patronizing but brutal authority. And if we take the two terms together, a patriarchal pathologization of female distress refers then to this tyrannical father figure who's looking at women's distress and making it out to be some kind of illness or disease. Now, historian Elaine Showalter has described how in the 19th century, almost all behavior in women, both in and outside of the asylum, that was seen as disruptive to the traditional sex-based roles of Victorian society, was pathologized in some way. And importantly, that this pathologization was expressed in biological and not really in environmental terms. So what I mean by that is, if something is expressed in environmental terms or given environmental causes, you could say X thing is happening because of these circumstances. If something is expressed in biological terms or given biological causes, you would say X is happening because of the biological factors that this person has. So it's the contrast between a nature and a nurture framing. Why is that important? Well, the majority of asylum patients in the mid-19th century were not just any women, but they were poor women. And in part, this was because certain supposed mental diseases were linked specifically to poor women, such as lactational insanity, which was thought to be a kind of anemia-induced madness brought on by prolonged periods of breastfeeding in malnourished poor mothers who could not otherwise afford to feed their children. But as Showalter highlights, even when physicians were discussing lactational insanity, they were, for the most part, not really engaging with the obvious underlying environmental cause, which was that many poor mothers couldn't afford to feed their families. Instead, they were focusing on how this was just one of the many examples of the ways in which the female reproductive cycle was littered with risk points for madness. In fact, new mothers were thought to be particularly at risk of insanity with so-called puerperal mania, not sure if that's the right pronunciation, but there we go, being such a widespread theory that it was commonly accepted as a criminal defense in cases of infanticide. So Showalter writes, such social causes of the disorder as poverty, inadequate obstetrical care, and the stigma of bearing illegitimate children were sometimes cited as contributing factors, but doctors, lawyers, and judges preferred to deal with the depression and violence of puerperal mania as an isolated, individual, and biologically determined phenomenon. Why is this happening? Well, arguably, it's because if the authorities at that time had actually taken the environmental causes seriously, they would have had to address everything Showalter listed here. So poverty, social stigma, obstetrical care for women, etc. But by emphasizing mainly the biological angle, they can avoid having to do that and instead locate the source of the mania with the individual failing or disorder of that woman. The point here is that by viewing female distress through this medicalized lens, by characterizing it as a medical pathology, you can position a carceral medical intervention as the solution, i.e. throwing them into an asylum, and avoid having to get into all the nitty-gritty social reasons as to why women's lives were so overwhelmingly fucked up. In this way, far from providing some new kind of care for women, the nascent profession of psychiatry served to bolster the patriarchal status quo. In total, by the mid-19th century, new mothers made up 10% of asylum inmates, and over the course of the 19th century, we see that spending on poor law relief, well, kind of like weekly cash allowance for the poor, declines at the same time as spending on asylums rises. One final stark historical example of how we can see that far from being an impartial, objective, and neutral force for good, the discipline of psychiatry reproduced the patterns of oppressions of its social context is in the case of Dr. Isaac Baker Brown. So Brown was a British gynecologist and obstetrical surgeon who was struck off the register of the Obstetrical Society of London in 1867 and was known for championing clitoridectomies, which is the surgical removal of the clitoris and sometimes parts of the labia, as the cure for all madness in women. Now, it's important to note that Brown was not struck off the register for his belief in the utility of clitoridectomies, which were still accepted as valid treatment for female insanity by many in the medical profession, but rather because Brown was accused of tricking and otherwise not fully informing his patients of what the procedure entailed, potentially ruining their marriage prospects because these women were seen as mutilated. So the concern for Brown's female patients comes again from this very patriarchal place. It's not about, the woman's own personal well-being or bodily integrity. It is about how the procedure may affect her attractiveness to men. In sum, far from questioning the position of women as primarily objects of male desire or recognizing their autonomy as full human beings, the logic behind striking Brown from the register was firmly rooted in the logic of patriarchy. After the final decision to expel Brown was made, the Secretary of the Royal Obstetrical Society had this to say: "We have constituted ourselves, as it were, the guardians of their women's interests, and in many cases the custodians of their honour. We are in fact the stronger and they the weaker. They are obliged to believe all that we tell them. They are not in a position to dispute anything we say to them. We therefore may be said to have them at our mercy. Under these circumstances, if we should depart from the strictest principles of honour, or if we should cheat or victimise them in any shape or way, we would be unworthy of the profession of which we are members." This speech was met with loud cheers from the gallery. Now, arguably, this trend towards a patriarchal pathologization of female distress and the use of this framing to justify oppressive regimes of institutionalization which disproportionately affect women are still things we see in psychiatry today. For example, legal scholar Rosanna Langer, in her discussion of the treatment of women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder within the Canadian criminal justice system, has emphasized that women with BPD diagnoses are much more likely to be institutionalized, whether in prisons or psychiatric wards, than the general population. Now, BPD was only recognized as a mental disorder in 1980 when it was officially added to the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a kind of manual produced by the American Psychiatric Association. It contains all of the diagnostic criteria for all of the mental disorders that they officially recognize and is more or less like the textbook for psychiatric diagnoses. Importantly, also within the American healthcare system, you cannot get insurance coverage for conditions that are not listed in the DSM, so it's like a really, really big deal. Anyway, BPD was added to the DSM in 1980, interestingly also the same year that PTSD was added, and it remains pretty controversial within the wider health sciences literature for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the vast majority of people diagnosed with BPD are women. The American Psychiatric Association estimates that women make up 75% of all BPD diagnoses. Secondly, because the majority of people diagnosed with BPD are physical or sexual assault survivors, leading to questions around whether, a PTSD diagnosis would have been more appropriate. And thirdly, because the diagnostic criteria for BPD themselves are grounded in gendered assumptions of what is like normal behavior, meaning some behaviors are seen as a symptom of BPD when presented in women, but not when presented in men, such as sexual promiscuity and explosive anger, both of which are pathologized for BPD diagnoses only in women. In fact, in blind studies where psychiatrists were given identical case files with only the gender changed, it was found that when the cases were labeled as pertaining to a man, they were much more likely to be diagnosed with PTSD, whereas when the gender was swapped to female, they were much more likely to be diagnosed with BPD. So this is not just a semantic issue, because the way we view these two disorders is incredibly different. For one thing, BPD is largely considered to be incurable, whereas there are accepted peer-reviewed treatments for PTSD. Relatedly, PTSD is just a much less stigmatized mental health condition, in part because it was one of the few conditions that places the cause of mental illness on an external trauma and not on some kind of personal biological failing. BPD, on the other hand, takes a much more Victorian-style approach to biological versus environmental factors. Whilst it is recognized that a lot of people with BPD are survivors of some kind of trauma, this is not the focus of the diagnosis. It's merely a passing detail, just as we saw with the 19th century mothers supposedly suffering from lactational insanity, whose abject poverty was portrayed as a contributing but not central factor. Even beyond questions of whether or not BPD is a valid diagnostic category, Langer, in her review of 20 years of Canadian case law, goes on to argue that the real problem women with BPD diagnoses face in the carceral system is not so much the diagnosis itself, but rather the fact that these diagnoses were used to consistently argue for punitive responses to disruptive behavior, such as segregation within the prison complex, frequent moves between institutions, and removal of any other freedoms or privileges. She states they, meaning incarcerated women, are not considered victims of circumstance, but as individuals incapable of adequately managing needs in a way that averts the seemingly foreseeable risks of crime, victimization, poverty, racism, and unemployment. Women with BPD may deteriorate in coercive and institutional settings, resulting in increases in both self-harm and angry behavior, and inconsequential perceptions of dangerousness. The diagnosis itself contributes to the erasure of causal socio-structural factors and provides the rationale for both zero-tolerance security approaches and tough love treatment programs. So essentially, BPD may itself be a kind of bullshit sexist diagnosis which pathologizes traumatized women in a way that traumatized men are not pathologized. However, even if it is not a bullshit diagnosis, the way that it is used within the legal system is repressive and essentially amounts to the weaponization of a tenuous and highly contested medical diagnosis to support arguments for further restrictions on the liberty of an individual, most often a woman. And I think we can see how there might be some pretty neat symmetry between the case of BPD and the admittedly much larger scale institutionalization of disruptive women in the Victorian era with medical diagnoses that later turned out to be bullshit, like hysteria, puerperal insanity, ovarian mania, nymphomania, etc. Now, again, I am not a medical professional, nor am I a mental health professional. I make these criticisms from a political and sociological standpoint. And what I'm not saying is that psychiatry is in some way especially evil, more so than any other system of power. What I am saying is that just like every other system of power and arguably every other system of knowledge, it is in fact plagued by the very same isms that we see throughout society: sexism, classism, racism, etc. It is not in fact above the general muck that we operate in as a species. Now, I don't want my meaning to be confused here. I'm not trying to wade into a level of relativism that says, no objective truth is possible because of the biases that are inherent in the human existence, so therefore let's just not even try. Admittedly, I'm not sure whether we as a species are capable of uncovering like a truly objective truth that's completely free from human bias, because I think that would require us to be able to detach ourselves completely from our subjective experience of the world, which I don't think is possible. But I do think some things are more true than others. And so it's still worthwhile at least trying to be more objective, if that makes sense. So even though psychiatry and arguably all fields of science have elements of human bias weaved throughout their very fabric, I do still think that they are more true, or shall we say evidence-based, than something like, say, astrology, right? Now, please don't come for me, astrology girlies. Like, I also enjoy partaking and I have co-star. I'm just saying it's not exactly like a rock solid theory that your time and location of birth meaningfully shaped your entire personality. But yeah, in essence, what I'm saying is, let's not run away with the idea that because scientific thinking is more evidence-based, it is therefore without any flaws. I think it's important that we can critique all systems of knowledge without that having to amount to a kind of nihilistic relativism. Okay, quick little tangent here before we get on to the last section of the show, because there's something I want to bring up around conversations I have had with people in the past about referencing certain philosophers or thinkers in the show. So I think it was in the episode on community when I talked about John Baudrillard and his theories of hyperreality. And a friend messaged me to essentially say that I shouldn't be referencing Baudrillard because he's a racist and a sexist, right? Now, Foucault may also not be like a morally good person. So French essayist Guy Sorman has alleged that he witnessed Foucault pay for sex with young boys whilst visiting him in Tunisia in the late 1960s, which would obviously be a form of child sexual abuse, given the inability of children to meaningfully consent to sex work. However, this accusation has been contested by others who knew Foucault at the time, and it's just still not very clear exactly what happened. Critics of Foucault have also highlighted that he was very publicly involved in the 1970s with a campaign against the age of consent laws in France, and they've characterized this as a support for the notion that children can meaningfully consent to sex with adults. However, supporters of Foucault have emphasized that this campaign against the age of consent laws was widely supported by a number of public intellectuals, including prominent second-wave feminist Simone de Beauvoir, and characterized Foucault's position not as advocating for sexual relationships between adults and children, but as support for equalizing the age of consent for heterosexual and homosexual relationships, since there was at the time a higher age of consent to engage in gay sex. It may also be revealing that one of the most vocal proponents of this whole Foucault was a gay paedophile notion is British radical feminist Julie Bindel, who is currently very much on the outs with the left for her views on transgender rights, which she characterizes as inherently misogynistic, and has claimed such deranged things as transgender activists want us to start referring to the vagina as a bonus hole. So all this to say, right, there are some people that might argue that I shouldn't reference or even read Foucault because he may have been a child abuser. But I don't agree with that take, and I don't think that I should have to do what I've just done here, setting out the arguments in favor and against the personal moral standing of a given figure in order to consider his ideas. I have in the past believed that that was necessary, but nowadays I just don't think that we need to only consider the ideas of morally good people. And I think that the Foucault example gives us an idea of the impossibility of actually doing that, right? Ultimately, none of us can know what happened in Tunisia in the 1960s. We can only say, these people have said this and these people have said that. More importantly, though, I think that knowledge is cumulative and referential, meaning that one idea builds on and references another idea. So if you start to try and cut out huge bits of the canon of ideas, it stops really making sense. And Foucault particularly has been unbelievably influential. His ideas have caused entirely new schools of thought to emerge in several disciplines, history being just one of them. He's probably the most important philosopher in the past 100 years, and he's also the most cited academic ever. So yeah, he might have been a terrible human being, but that simply cannot be the basis on which we should choose to include or exclude his ideas. Now, for my overall point, not to sound massively Jordan Peterson-y here, but we are arguably living in a time with a relative dearth of philosophical systems of meaning. at least in the West, right? So belief in religion has been steadily declining. Political ideology as a whole is simultaneously less subscribed to, and where it exists is arguably more heavily fractured than at any point in the past 30 years or so. Like, I know it seems hard to believe when you presumably live in the same, like, hyper-engaged echo chamber as me, if you're listening to this show, but statistically, engagement in politics has declined sharply in the UK since the 1990s. And a lot of the institutions that used to organize our lives are also in massive decline. You know, think the decline of the nuclear family, the disappearance of jobs for life, etc. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is like an inherently bad thing. A lot of these institutions were extremely oppressive, and their decline actually, you know, reflects the relative growth in social power of previously more heavily oppressed groups like gender and sexual minorities. What I am saying, though, is that whether these institutions were good or bad, their decline means that we live in more uncertain times. Couple this with the rise of new technologies, which make things like deep fakes a realistic, everyday occurrence, and our increasing detachment from any anchoring sense of reality is complete. It's not like back in 2004 when reality-grounded cinematic classics such as National Treasure were released and things used to mean something, and Nicolas Cage had to steal the Declaration of Independence to save America. Within this context, a mental health framing emerges as one possible thing to sort of structure your life around. A series of rituals focused on self-care, maintaining your boundaries, and otherwise optimizing your mental state. But what's the issue with that exactly? Now, if you're a regular podcast listener, which I suspect that some of you are, given that you are listening to this podcast, you may have noticed a particularly large upswing in advertising from a popular online therapy subscription service, which shall remain nameless for legal reasons, lest my producer goes into cardiac arrest. Anyway, this nameless therapy subscription service advertises itself as making it easier to get therapy, essentially by putting you in touch with like mental health professionals of various stripes who can provide therapy to you online at a supposedly cheaper than standard rate. Now, I listen to podcasts all the time, so I probably listen to like 2 or 3 different ones per day. So I'm getting these ads all the fucking time. And the advert goes something like, you know, is your social battery drained? And do you need to find better strategies to prioritize your own well-being and say no to social plans? So much like we discussed already with the tweet templates for rejecting social plans and the reels advising you on how to break up with your friend, we are seeing how, again, the core message of the modern mental health discourse is essentially this. Your love, attention, and energy are a finite resource, which you sacrifice to others at your own risk in a zero-sum game. Your mental health is constantly under threat, and other people in your life are the source of that threat. And this is really the core of my issue with modern mental health discourses. It is based on a highly individualistic understanding of human suffering and serves to fundamentally atomize us as a society, to drive us away from each other in order to then sell us an increasing array of tools or weapons to protect our peace. And the selling part is extremely important because we shouldn't ignore the commercial incentive here. What I'm saying is, the propagation of these discourses is not a coincidence. There is an entire pocket of industries that are economically dependent on this framing of human suffering as an individual biological problem to be resolved through pharmaceutical intervention and/or talking therapies. So this includes your web subscription therapy services, your individual wellness and therapy influencers, your workplace cognitive behavioral therapy coaches, your mental health first aid training programs, and the pharmaceutical industry at large. Practicing psychotherapist and professor of medical anthropology James Davies has written an excellent book on this entitled Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. In it, Davies is highly critical of what he sees to be a deliberate obfuscation of the ways in which the underlying conditions of our lives have gotten significantly worse, whether that be through like stagnating wages and labor conditions or skyrocketing housing prices and environmental pollution, etc., by a mental health framing which portrays what are arguably extremely rational human distress responses to these worsening conditions as some kind of individual pathology, and then purports to sell you the solution in some neat little package of mental health interventions, which Davies argues are themselves almost invariably completely ineffective. For example, in chapter 10 of the book, Davies recounts the story of Emma, one of his early patients, a young mother from a council estate who had herself been raised in foster care and had recently escaped an abusive relationship with the father of her young child, Mimi, only to have her mother-in-law arbitrarily limit access to Mimi whilst ostensibly seeking to support Emma in her recovery from the abuse that she suffered at the hands of her son through a shared custody agreement. So Davies recounts how Emma had been diagnosed with clinical depression by her GP, prescribed a course of antidepressants, and recommended talking therapy at his practice. However, it was only after Davies and the community solicitor intervened to ensure Emma could regain full custody of her daughter that her mental state improved. So of this encounter, Davies says, I recount Emma's story here because it illustrates something that I, as a fledgling therapist, had not expected to encounter when I was working in my very first placement. That the vast majority of people making use of mental health services, those who had been diagnosed and prescribed psychiatric medication, were not mentally ill or dysfunctional in any substantiated or biological sense. They were rather people experiencing the inevitably painful human consequences of being engulfed by life's difficulties or severe misfortunes. This is not to diminish their suffering in any way, not to deny that they deserve care and support as Emma evidently did. It is just to say that there's nothing scientifically valid or indeed clinically helpful in reclassifying understandable human suffering as a mental pathology, especially when this often just leads to more stigma and individualistic interventions like being prescribed psychiatric medication, often long-term. Elsewhere in the book, Davies describes how long-term prescriptions of psychiatric medication have increasingly become the norm in the UK, with around 4.4 million people living today in England having taken antidepressants for 2 years or more, and with 7.4 million adults being prescribed antidepressants in 2021. He emphasizes that this push towards long-term prescribing is a direct consequence of the pharmaceutical industry's own advertising, since drug companies intentionally propagated two unsubstantiated myths about their antidepressants, beginning via a symposium held by drug company Eli Lilly in 1996 regarding their then new wonder pill Prozac. In the symposium, company-sponsored physicians argued that this new generation of antidepressants were firstly a necessary treatment for long-term depression, and secondly posed limited risks as withdrawal symptoms from these medications were allegedly mild, implying that they could more or less be tried on for size. The result has been that the received wisdom within the medical professions was that antidepressants are a proportionate first port of call for clinical depression, and further that any worsening of symptoms whilst attempting to withdraw a patient from antidepressants should be viewed as a reason to keep them on the medication or even to increase the dosage. A Public Health England review of prescribing practices published in 2020 found that patients frequently reported experiencing withdrawal symptoms when stopping a range of medications, including benzodiazepines, Z-drugs, opioids, and antidepressants. That the effect of these symptoms could last many months, and further that their doctors frequently did not acknowledge or recognize their withdrawal symptoms. It also found that patients felt there was a lack of information on the risks of these medications and that they were not offered any non-pharmaceutical treatment options. Davies has argued that the reason these pharmaceutical interventions continue to be prioritized, despite expressed desire from patients for alternative treatment options and mounting evidence of the negative outcomes of these drugs for the patient experience, is largely economic. So it is quite simply cheaper and less disruptive to the status quo to engage in mass prescribing of psychiatric medications than it is to meaningfully address the underlying causes of mounting human distress, or to create a transformative mental health approach that is not based on pathologizing the individual, but instead on fortifying communities. So much like we saw with the propaganda spread by early psychiatrists during the first psychiatric revolution regarding the allegedly, humane and progressive nature of their newfound asylums, I think we still have ample reason to question a framing of human distress that individualizes the problem and privatizes the solution. Fundamentally, I think we need to begin to slowly dismantle the monopoly of the medicalized view of mental health over human suffering. Again, I'm not saying that a medical approach is never appropriate, but what I am saying is that if our suffering as human beings can only be validated, recognized, and addressed if we're able to bundle it up in some kind of psychiatric category, that's a big fucking problem. And it's a problem not only because, as we have seen, psychiatry is not neutral, impartial, and objective in our society. It has time and again replicated the repressive power structures that we see all around us, but also because it precludes our ability to meaningfully engage with the wider societal issues that cause the vast majority of human distress. And I think it should be fairly obvious by now that ultimately this is what we need to do if we want to meaningfully lessen human suffering, because we've been doing the whole fiercely individualized psychiatric approach for some time now, and I'm just not sure that the vibes have gotten any better, my guys. So that's all from me today, folks. Thanks a lot for joining me. I will see you next time. If you like the show, please check out my other episodes and subscribe on your favorite platform. If you really like the show, remember you can support it at patreon.com/militantempathy. And now over to our sponsor, BetterHelp. No, for legal reasons, I must say that they do not sponsor this show. But I mean, if you guys want to give us some money, I'm not opposed to it. Get in touch.